countless times, and I want to believe it. And I actually have some footage here of Professor Ames enjoying his delicious life. I have him here enjoying some spam musubi and a hot dog and shaved ice and some pizza. That's not actual footage. He's also written, of course, I should go to the real introduction. He's also written several authoritative translations of ancient Chinese texts, and his commentaries form substantial bedrock for understanding Chinese philosophy today. He is a hub around which so many things move. He's been the editor of Philosophy East and West, innumerable SUNY Press and University of Hawaii Press books and volumes. Basically, if it's Chinese or Chinese comparative philosophy, he's always a part of it somehow. That would be impressive enough. But to think of all the relationships that he continuously nurtures, when he could very well and justifiably say, I'm real busy and I can't, it's just something truly rare and precious. And how does he do it? How does he do all this and answer my emails at 4 in the morning? Have y'all watched those timestamps? But I have the answer, I think. I think that there are maybe 2 Rogers. There must be. He couldn't get it all done otherwise. So please join me in welcoming one of them now. Thanks.
Very nice, Sid. Very nice.
Thank you.
Let me just be sure I've got the right. There we go. So are we ready to go, Sid? Can you hear me? Very nice. And thank you very much for the unusual, but typically Sid introduction. What I wanted to talk about today is, for me, is very important because it really challenges the way in which China is viewed today. Just as an overview, before I begin, because I might not be able to get through it, the kinds of issues that the human being faces in the 21st century all require a planetary response, whether we're talking about global warming or environmental degradation or massive species extinction or food and water shortages or international terrorism or proxy wars, whatever. All of the things that we are facing today require a planetary response. And what we have discovered is that the zero-sum Westphalian model of modern nation states, sovereign and equal, has been woefully inadequate in resolving our human predicament. And so Michael Walzer, who is one of our most distinguished political philosophers, he tasks us with the search for a thin, universalist, minimalist morality, and bring solidarity among the world's peoples and cultures. His own proposal, he's a self-confessed liberal, a political pluralist, a internationalist in his own orientation, but what he proposes is a kind of garden variety concept of justice. What I want to do is I want to join him in this search for a shared morality, but I want to begin from the isomorphism among family, state, and world that we find in Confucian philosophy, where state and world are simulacra of family. That is to say that family is the model and state and world are reflections of that same kind of model, that same kind of paradigm. And what I want to do is I want to argue for a Confucian response to this search for minimalist morality that I find in this notion of xiao, in this notion of family reverence. So that's the big picture. So let's look at it in its details. That Walzer, in his book Thick and Thin: Moral Argument at Home and Abroad, endorses the politics of difference, and at the same time is looking for a kind of shared common consensus. By thick moralities, he's talking about Islam and Buddhism, Hinduism, liberalism, Ubuntu, and so on. And very importantly, we have to understand what he means when he's talking about a minimalist morality. What he's talking about is not some kind of foundational common idea or principle. That's not what he's looking for. What he insists upon is far from some kind of objective principle, some kind of ideal, a reiteratively particularist and locally significant, intimately bound up with the maximal moralities created here and here and here in specific times and places. And the closest that he gets to articulating this morality is a set of standards to which all societies can be held, negative injunctions, most likely, rules against murder, deceit, torture, oppression, and tyranny. And these standards will probably be expressed in the language of rights, which is the language of our own moral maximalism, his own liberal thinking. But that is not a bad way of talking about injuries and wrongs that no one should have to endure, and I assume that it is translatable. And so we get a kind of a picture of Walzer's own response to this search. Importantly, by minimalist, he's not talking about something that is shallow or something that is minor or incidental. He wants to say that this minimalist morality is thin and in intensity coming together as morality close to the bone. And he demands a lot from this close to the bone morality, in the sense that he is demanding of it a kind of shared solidarity, a kind of world consensus that can bring us together in a world that is very much fragmented. Now, what I've done is I've drawn on the Confucian tradition rather than liberalism, but in doing so, I purposely apply a pragmatic method in asking after the thatness of the morality as a specifically experienced meaning. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that that we don't want to begin from abstract ideals, grand theories, remote principles. And Walzer is on board with this. Walzer himself says, in a world of particular cultures, competing conceptions of the good, scarce resources, elusive and expansive needs, there isn't going to be a single formula universally applicable. And so I'm not introducing something that Walzer is not on board with, but what I want to do is I want to follow behind Walzer. Like, Walzer was one of the important responses to John Rawls' theory of justice, and there are a couple of other voices that come behind Walzer with his pluralism and with his insistence on keeping the discussion close to the human experience. Robert Solomon argues that there is no coherent ideal of justice. Justice claims are always contextual and presuppose a local set of conditions and considerations. And Solomon goes on in his A Passion for Justice when he says that what is natural in us is our sense of being with others, not just in affection and dependency, but in our sense of ourselves and our interests. And so from start to finish, these interests are tied up with other people. What is natural in us, I want to argue, is neither self-interest nor global benevolence, but reciprocity. Now, this is Solomon, the interdependence of the human being, our shared lives together. But maybe the most important voice that I want to bring in from the liberal side that takes me in the direction of this Confucian concept of xiao is Elizabeth Wolgast, who argues that our sense of justice begins at home. Now, Wolgast is a Wittgensteinian who argues that that the emotional responses we have to immorality are themselves rock in their meaning and are in need of no further explanation. She argues that we learn morality and the moral vocabulary together and come to have a sense of injustice at the same time. We not only learn behavior and meanings together, but learn them very young. This is Wittgenstein. Not only does Wolgast follow Wittgenstein in insisting that language meshes with life, but in her work, she underscores the necessary and symbiotic roles within the family, both parents and children, as they cultivate their moral competence together. And so this is Wolgast. The connection of a young child with her parents is not simply between an authority and an underling. It is a complicated reciprocal relation in which the child's behavior reflects back on the parent, both as a parent and a person, a sense of shame. And the parent's example, both in expression and in action, serves as a pattern for the child, a role model. Morally speaking, you might say that they're mutually dependent and symbiotic, even though the child is in other ways dependent and immature. So sort of bringing this together, for Solomon and Wolgast, we develop our sense of what is moral, not from the application of some pre-existing principle or ideal, but practically and incrementally from earliest childhood in the feelings we share in our families as we respond to perceived instances of immorality. Now, so in turning away from abstract principles and concepts and theories, I want to take as my starting point Dewey's postulate of immediate empiricism and the primacy he gives to experience and to practice. For Dewey, theorizing emerges out of practice in order to make practice more intelligent, more productive. And so the starting point is always practice, is experience. Our problems emerge in our experience, and we theorize them in order to theorize the same experience in order to make the outcomes more intelligent. And to be clear what Dewey is saying, immediate empiricism postulates that things, anything, everything in the ordinary or non-technical use of the term thing, are what they are experienced as. If you wish to find out what subjective, objective, physical, mental, cosmic, psychic, cause, substance, purpose, activity, evil, being, quality, a minimalist morality, any philosophic term, in short, means go to experience and see what the thing is experienced as. So this is Dewey's exhortation to begin from practice itself. And I would argue that that is a Confucian commitment. The inseparability, 知行合一, is another way of saying the postulate of immediate empiricism. And so corollary to Dewey's immediate empiricism is a recognition of the fact that experience itself is always a continuous, a collaborative, and an unbounded affair. That's the nature of experience. And if we're speaking Chinese, it would be 主客合一, the inseparability of person and world. And so Dewey's hadness of experience, far from precluding a robust subjective aspect, in fact insists upon it. More recently, another pragmatist, rejecting view from nowhere objectivism, Hilary Putnam makes a similar argument on behalf of the subjective dimension of experience. So in Putnam's language, elements of what we call language or mind penetrate so deeply into what we call reality that the very project of representing ourselves as being mappers of something language independent is fatally compromised from the start. Like relativism, but in a different way, realism, objective realism, is an impossible attempt to view the world from nowhere. So Putnam will not admit of an understanding of the real world that would cleave it off from its human participation and that does not accept our experience of it as what the world really is. And so he makes the same point. The heart of pragmatism, it seems to me, of James and Dewey's pragmatism, if not Peirce's, was the supremacy of the agent point of view. If we find that we must take a certain point of view, use a certain conceptual system when engaged in a practical activity in the widest sense of practical activity, then we must not simultaneously advance the claim that it is not really the way things are themselves. Okay, so now we have this idea of immediate empiricism, and we have the collaborative nature of experience itself. So how can we bring these to the empirical question of searching for a minimalist morality? Can we identify any historical examples of such a morality? And if so, what has this morality been experienced as? So this is my starting point. My argument is that the close to the bone morality has in fact been experienced in a Confucian world as family feeling, and that a consensus, and I use the word consensus very, very specifically because con is together and sentir is feeling. And so consensus is not one thing. Consensus is a shared feeling, a common feeling. And so I want to say that this notion of xiao and the terms that surround it are the substance of what we might look at as a shared morality. And what I want to begin from, too, is to make the observation that many of you, I'm sure, are aware of, and that is the Confucian moral vision is modal rather than referencing specific actions. That the terms, the language of Confucian ethics it has to do with the cultivation of a habitude. It has to do with the cultivation of a particular disposition as opposed to identifying specific things to do. There's no right and wrong. There's no this and that. There's no rules. There's no catechism. But there's the how rather than the what in the Confucian moral vocabulary. We want to cheng. We want to xin. We want to zhong. We want to xiao, we want to ren, we want to he. And so all of these are dispositions that enable us in specific situations to select out, to identify and select out the most productive road forward. And so, this notion of xiao is not stipulating specific conducts, but really is talking about a habitude, a disposition that we have. And while I'm offering China as an empirical example of how family feeling has sustained this continental civilization with all of its diversity over the millennia as a persistent culture, what I want to argue is that we're not going to be persuading Italians and Ugandans that they should become Confucian. The Confucian example is that this huge part of humanity has maintained a kind of unity in diversity, 和而不同, over the millennia, and that if other moralities, such as the liberalism of Italy or the Ubuntu of Uganda, that they can find in their own traditions this same of the same sense of family reverence. And so what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about where China came from, and this notion of tianxia, that Zhao Tingyang, one of our most prominent and interesting contemporary Chinese philosophers, really has formulated a theory, a tianxia qi xi, a planetary system that will lead us to yi tianxia, guan tianxia, to looking at the world as the world, to develop a new shared planetary kind of a vocabulary. And often Zhao Tingyang has been criticized because he uses the term tianxia, which is a Chinese term rather than an English term like planetary order. He's been accused of promoting a kind of Chinese hegemony, and I think that is wrong. That Zhao Tingyang is really advocating this theory that he draws out of game theory, that for me is a kind of Rawlsian, rational theory that people buy into because it serves their own best interests. That I find real limitations on his theory of tianxia, but I don't think that the problem with it is the idea that he's advocating for a Chinese hegemony. I'll get to my concerns in a minute. So what his concept of tianxia begins from is a manifold of unique nation states within a political organism. Why? There's no outside. There's an yo nei zai or meo wai zai. There's an internal, but not, and so he's not talking about international, he's talking about intranational. His starting point is that sovereign nation states are a second order abstraction out of the real human experience, that we experience the world together, that flowing across political boundaries is the culture and the art and the popular music and the food and everything else, that political boundaries are second order abstractions, and that we have to really understand the human experience in ecological terms. And so when he's talking about his concept of order, and this is very important, he's talking about yi duo bu fen. He's talking about a model, and this is Walzer as well. When Walzer is talking about a universalism and particularism, where these two things can't be separated, that absent in the model is any single privileged and dominant order that would override its others. That it's yi duo bu fen, that the yi is seen from each perspective within the world order, that each nation state, each unique nation state construes the planetary order from its own particular perspective. And so there is no dominant perspective, that all of these different nation states are different by virtue of the relationship within the social and political ecology that they share with everyone else. So just to say that again, the identity of each focal holographic state emerges from its unique pattern of relations within the vital functioning of the world organism. And the living global ecology itself is a holistic and inclusive aesthetic order rather than a reductionistic rationalized order, engendered by the mutual accommodation of these unique focal states. So Zhao Tingyang goes on and he asks the question that has been a major theme over the last few decades in China itself, particularly in the Chinese discourse, and that is, where did China come from? Where did China come from? And Zhao Tingyang tasks us to 重视中国, to rethink China. So his rethinking of China is relational. It's inside and outside. For those outside of China, it is thinking with China by trying to include a Chinese perspective and to try to take China on its own terms. So this is one point. I would say that one of the main problems why China is so vilified in the world today is that there never is a Chinese perspective as part of the discourse. Totalitarianism, dictatorship, and so on. Too simple. Genocide. I mean, how these terms are really very strong. And is there a Chinese perspective on these international issues? Or is it simply creating an enemy, creating an object of creating a pariah state? For China, is thinking with the world community, thereby making a concerted effort to accommodate the world's many different perspectives as integral to its own self-understanding. And so this idea of 重视中国, I think, is really an important exhortation that Zhao tasks us with. And so when he is talking about, when he's trying to answer this question, where did China come from, he offers us this idea of a 象形漩涡, a kind of centripetal whirlpool, as a model of world order that begins on the central plain of China 4,000 years ago, and that over time draws into China all of the different populations that border the central plain. Now, what we have to understand is that China, as a population, is about the same as Africa. That China, as a population, is almost twice the combined population of an Eastern and Western Europe. And so China is Zhongzhou, not Zhongguo. That it is a continental civilization of enormous proportions in terms of different kinds of people, different languages, different models of government, and so on. All of the diversity you find in Africa or that you find in Europe. And so what has drawn these people into this kind of a shared identity over time have been cultural attractors, where Zhao identifies the Chinese written character as primary, and then the canonical texts, the philosophical, historical, canonical texts that were generated out of this cultural attractor that are perpetuated, that are kind of a shared intellectual and also a spiritual theology that brings the culture together. And so these attractors have, from earliest times and without respite, drawn the many disparate populations of the Central Plain and the expanding circle of its surrounding territories into a political and cultural whirlpool. And I would even extend Zhao's concept. He doesn't talk about this, but we really have to see, as part of that whirlpool, Korea and Japan and Vietnam as kind of Sinitic cultures that share the Chinese character. We might also, the diaspora throughout Southeast Asia, and that includes populations in Vancouver, where I grew up. The second language of Vancouver is Chinese, and so this identity, this Chinese identity, is radial. And we might even understand the term 中国 itself quite literally as a centered and focal polity, rather than the Middle Kingdom or some variation on that, a centered and focal polity. Now, what I want to think about is that, and we maybe we'll have time to talk about in the discussion, but this idea of where did China come from really entails values that are very different from autonomous individuality and rationality and so on. There's a kind of, within this family-centered model, there's the notion of relational equity as opposed to equality. Let's take that as an example. Relational equity, as Sydney pointed out, is grandpa having a glass of wine at the end of the day so that he can have a good night's sleep. And baby, my granddaughter Sophia, having her milk so that she can grow strong bones and so that she can grow herself as a strong and healthy young person. Like the glass of wine and the glass of milk are different, but there's a relational equity there. And by having that relational equity, activating that kind of equity gives us a rich diversity. It gives us the diversity of a 3-generation, 4-generational family as a possibility. And so this combination of relational equity and achieved diversity is really important. What I want to observe is that there has been enough of a shared minimalist morality in this Chinese experience to hold it together as a continuous civilization and history for 4,000 years and counting. And that the morality itself is the product of organic growth within our immediate familial and communal roles and relationships. And Zhao Tingyang talks about this with his metaphors of jiagan and shengzheng, to set the root and grow therefrom. And so when we look at the growth of China, I've developed this new term. In classical Greek, we talk about ontology. In China, I want to talk about zootology, not the science of being in itself, but the art of living and growth. 生生之谓义，天地之大德曰生，生生不息，生生不息. You know, this idea of 生生 as being a fundamental value in the tradition that gives us this notion of biantong, of continuity in change. And so when we look at China, the history of China, and when we observe that China has been ruled, imperial China, for almost half of its history by what would be construed as foreigners, the Yuan dynasty, the Qing dynasty, the Liao, the Jurchens, and all of these different populations ruling over China, that this diversity is certainly there. But I also want to be critical of Zhao Tingyang in the sense that he tells a rather romantic story and glides rather quickly over the costs of the war and carnage that was always the present factor. We need only to remember that the juggernaut of Genghis Khan and the Mongol conquest during the 13th century, in which it is estimated that over 10% of all humanity perished. Another daunting criticism is that Zhao's Tianxia system arises from an attempt to dehistoricize Tianxia with game theory, with a rational kind of a model, and so doing to make it into a purely rational and thus universalizable theoretical and contractarian model that is really reminiscent of the theoretical transcendentalism of John Rawls. But what for me is really the important criticism of Zhao's story, a story that I like very much, is precisely an account of the minimalist morality, not only as it has been made explicit in the same canonical texts that provide the shared identity, but also as it has been practiced across the centuries and is practiced today. And so the cluster of the terms surrounding xiao as the prime moral imperative has made family feeling not only the explanation of the Confucian minimalist morality, but also the root and substance of the Confucian social, political, and global order that lives on today. This is where I want to look at this alternative conception of the political, where there is a perceived isomorphism that obtains among the family, political, and global orders. A kind of organic symbiosis that Mencius describes. He says that there's a popular maxim heard among the people who say, 天下国家, 天下之本在国, 国之本在家, 家之本在神. That the world, the state, the family, the world is rooted in the state in the family in one's own person. And I want to argue that this model persists today, that this has been the definition of China across the centuries, and that when we look at the classical tradition, if we go to the Analects of Confucius, Confucius says some mean-spirited person says to Confucius, if you're such a distinguished teacher and scholar, how come you've never had a role in government? And where Confucius's response is that the institution of family is integral to the production of social and political order of the state. Why are you not employed in government? The master replied, the Book of Documents says, it all lies in family reverence. Being filial to your parents and finding fraternity with your brothers is in fact carrying out the work of governing. In doing these things, I am participating in governing. Why must I be employed in government? Yan Fu, the great translator who brought Western liberalism into China, remarks that if you look back on the 2,000 years of imperial Chinese history and talk about social and political order, that maybe 30% of it you can associate with the emperor, but 70% you have to talk about jiazu, shizu, family lineages, clan lineages, as the source of order in China during this time. We use the word government in a very modern sense, but when we think about social and political order in the tradition, it is so firmly grounded, jiagan, shengzheng, so firmly grounded in the concept of family. And we see this over and over again. I'm going to skip through these because of our time constraints. One allusion that I want to make is at Harvard, there's a historian named James Hankins, who's written a new book called Virtue Politics. I met Hankins in Hangzhou a few years ago. And his argument is it's got really nothing to do with China in the sense that he's talking about Renaissance Europe and looking at Italy in particular. But his argument is that the difference between a flourishing state in Renaissance Italy and a failed state has very little to do with constitutions and the institutions of government and sort of the formal structures of the polity, but rather has to do with the moral education and careful training of its rulers. And the reason that I met this man in Hangzhou was because he sees this virtue politics, and the last chapter of his book is called Ex Orient Lux, the light from the East, because he traces the title of his book, Virtue Politics, to the notion of renjiang, that we find in Mencius, but also a concept of the political that we find in Xunzi very much as well. And so I'm going to skip this. So just to finish up with the classical text, Wang Chong in the Han Dynasty says that sages take the whole world as their family without distinction between near or far, domestic or foreign. In their undertakings, the sages seek what is optimally appropriate. The best and most sagacious would family the whole world, not Ping Tianxia, but Jia Tianxia. And Mencius, too, makes the same kind of recommendation that everybody is located within family, and that affection for parents is an expression of consummate conduct of Ren that is grounded in xiao. Respecting elders is an expression of yi that is grounded in xiao. For no other reason than this, such values have to be encouraged throughout the world. So what I want to do then, just to finish up here, is I want to say that there are several sort of reasons that recommend this kind of Confucian alternative to a liberal conception of justice or a structure of human rights. I don't think that these things are exclusive, but family feeling is, for most people, their highest value. That the very word familiar comes from the root, the same root as family. And it has the potential to bring us together, that when we look at each other as family in terms of family roles and relationships, it is a way of getting past the us and them binary. It is the most inclusive appeal within the human experience. And even though even though family reverence, qin, the family feeling is felt differently in different cultures, it still provides a common core morality for all of humankind that in itself is more fundamental than theorizing or thinking. Even family feeling is really takes us to this pragmatic requirement of specifically experienced meaning rather than concepts or theories. It takes us to what Walzer wants as morality close to the bone. Now, what also recommends this idea of family feeling as a thin morality is that an argument can be made that family is the governing metaphor of China. Like when we speak Chinese, we talk about 大家请站起来, big family, not everybody individually, but big family, please stand up. We don't talk about 国, we talk about 国家. We don't talk about humanity, we talk about 人家, human family. And so family is the governing metaphor, and the strategy is that family is that human institution to which we commit ourselves utterly and without remainder. If family needs time, money, a body part, your life, there is this obligation felt that one has to give what one can to family. And family is not incidental in the education and the growth of moral competence. Loving others is a precondition for behaving morally, and one can only learn to love others by being loved oneself. Such intimacy is the only way. So proper family relations in infancy are an essential ground for socializing persons and integrating them into the community. Simply put, family nurturance is not optional in the process of becoming moral. If a child is not given family feeling within the within the first days, weeks, months, years of a life, that child is put at real risk in terms of being a healthy member of the community. Again, the underdeterminacy of family and family feeling lies it to function analogically rather than essentially or categorically when we're looking for this shared consensus. Again, that Susan Moeller-Oken, in her work on justice, gender, and family, makes the argument that the family is the schoolroom of these higher order values, that you can't get to justice within the state unless you have justice in the family. And of course, her argument is that families that are saturated with gender discrimination are not a basis on which a healthy society can be constructed. Bernard Williams argues that because she is my wife is a powerful argument in saving a drowning person over another drowning person that doesn't need to be further theorized. I don't have to give a reason for saving my wife over somebody else. It is one thought too many. That the family feeling has its place in the vision of the moral life as something that is preemptive rather than retributive, and that means that a positive sense of shame brings people together and preempts antisocial behaviors rather than punishing them by dealing with hard cases. And so as a basis for an ethic, here we go. The idea too, like I see a lot of the problems that we face in the world today as a function of a kind of international anarchism, each state, sovereign state out for its own advantage, that is a kind of scaled up version of the liberal values of autonomy and freedom and rationality and choice and so on. That this, my colleague Henry Rosemont, my collaborator, in his book on Against Individualism, that individualism has become an ideology, and it justifies a kind of pernicious self-interest by separating privilege and responsibility, entitlements and obligations. And also family teaches us the wisdom of interdependence, that the only way that I can be a good teacher is by having good students. And the better my students, and this is one of my great satisfactions in this short life, that the quality of my students have given me this enormous satisfaction, that if your neighbor does better, you do better, that we're interdependent, and that we don't want altruism, we don't want egoism. We want to understand that morality is the cultivation of the relationships that constitute us as human beings. And a final point here, and that is that in as an ultimate source of economic strength and security in every human culture, there's nothing that governments can do that will provide an adequate social welfare service, that we rely upon family, that we can't get by without family. It is the bedrock, it is the ground. And also, when we look at the world around us, we live in a world that is dominated by liberal values. But if we look at the world's population more broadly. Maybe those liberal values are defining of 20% of European and American and Asian urban elites and so on, this kind of enlightenment understanding of human beings. But the great majority of the rest of the world subscribe to values that are closer to Confucian values. Their self-understanding is that they are embedded in a social ecology of daughters and sons, mothers and fathers, spouses, siblings, cousins, neighbors, members of clans, all with close ties to specific geographic areas and communities, religious and secular. And so this idea of family feeling as the minimalist morality is already in place in the broadest swath of the human experience. And so to finish up, I want to say that the importance of intergenerationality in human relations and interactions can be appreciated anew. A different way of defining oneself can be envisaged. A more robust concept of social justice might replace the narrow definition currently in vogue, and even death and dying might be approached differently. And so what I want to recommend today is that there is an important philosophical task to inquire more deeply into the role of family feeling in the formulation of a minimalist ethic for a new planetary order. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Roger. So we have some pre-prepared comments, some commentators coming up first. If you have any burning questions that you'll want to ask after the commentators, if there's time, then I encourage you to type them out in the chat, and then we can address them after the commentators have spoken. With that, I'll welcome the first commentator, Professor Zhang Rongnan. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Professor Roger Ames. Your lecture have a lot of insights and I really benefit from your lecture. I especially agree with you that even today, most people will take family as their highest value. And in China, we will say that our country is our big family, if only if that the country is stable, that the family could be flourishing. Yes, so I totally agree with it. But now I have some comments and also questions for you, because we know that not just you, but also many philosophers in China, such as Zhao Jingyang and Sun Xiangchen, they all want to develop a kind of philosophy of Shenshen or family. So the family is our central concern. But here there are many people worrying that, for example, many modern Chinese as Westerners believe that moral principles work in private sphere, like family, is different from the principle work in public sphere. So, for example, they will say that in family, we naturally favor our family members more than strangers. But in public sphere, we need principles such as justice, because only justice could will remind us to treat every people equally. So this is, we know, this is also a debate in Western moral philosophy. Another concern, and also is what I worry in recent years, in China, not just in China, but also in Japan and Korea, family face the real challenge, because more and more Chinese young people, they don't want to get married. They take their personality development, their safe development as higher value, even than get married and have a family. So we know that a family is a place that will give us warmth and give us care. But people they have higher pressure in the market economy. They hope that through their work, they could have their safe realization. So how to, facing such realities, how to persuade those people that family, if there is no family, then how could family be a place for people to cultivate themselves? So this is a real challenge. And also, this is also might be a challenge from the Western liberalism, because we know that Confucian tradition emphasizes the importance of personal cultivation. But personal cultivation is the preparation for us to enter into the public sphere, to serve more people, to serve even our country or the 天下. And such how to say such so xiao or Confucian cultivation has a tendency of perfectionism. But what you call the minimalist morality, I think it's anti-perfectionism. So I don't know how to coordinate to such tendencies. So finally, my question for you is: do you think is it necessary for us to reinterpret ideas as family and xiao to how to say to apply to the modern world? Because when Chinese people or many Western people, when they talk about Confucian xiao, they will think xiao is work in hierarchical order, and the family practice sometimes are oppressive. So this is very different from our anticipation about modern family. We hope it could be diversified. We hope we have mutual respect, and especially women, right? They're worried to enter into families. They don't want to sacrifice for their partner, maybe as in the traditional family. So these are so my question is both theoretical and also realistic. I hope Professor Ames could give us your thinking about those questions. Thank you. That is my comments and questions.
Thank you, Zhang Laoshi. Really very, very good questions. Do I answer now, or should I wait for the second set of questions?
Go ahead and wait. Go ahead and answer it now, and then we'll address the second commentator.
And I'll try to be brief so that we don't take up all the time. The first one about justice, a public and private kind of somehow or other justice belongs to the public world, but it doesn't belong to the private world. I think that is where we have something to learn from Confucianism. The idea of abstract principle justice is not justice. That real justice has to be holistic. That real justice has to take into account not only general interests of a population, but must also take into account our individual differences. And so that's where you get this idea of relational equity, that real justice requires relational equity. We don't want blind justice. Blind justice says we have to ignore our differences in order to apply a sort of an abstract standard to deracinated individuals. And I don't think you can get justice out of that. The second question, I agree with you. You know that I gave a lecture at Yuelu Shuyuan in Hunan, and after my talk and all of this good Confucian stuff, a young woman stood up and she said, "Hey, I'm 30 years old. I'm an artist. I don't want children. I got my friends. I got my life." She says, "Does your Confucianism have room for me?" And I said, if it doesn't have room for you, it's not my Confucianism. That Confucianism has to construe family in many different ways. And this is your last question. Family always has to be redefined for a modern world. Many of my Confucian colleagues, particularly male colleagues, particularly older male colleagues, they think that when I say that Confucianism can accommodate same-sex marriage, that Confucianism can accommodate alternative ways of conceiving a family, they think, this is Lao Wai, sort of sneaking liberal values into our Confucianism. Let's push them out. And my argument would be that unless Confucianism is relevant to the contemporary world, it's not going to it's not going to be relevant. So that would be my my answer. And I don't think that there's a tension between personal cultivation within a xiao model and perfectionism. I think that everything in the Confucian tradition begins from personal cultivation. Personal cultivation is the family is not self-abnegation. Family is making the greatest contribution that you, Zhang Rongnan, can make to your family.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. I'd like to welcome the next commentator, Professor Jing.
Thank you, Sydney. Thank you, Roger. It's my great honor to be here. And I was a little bit timid when Paul invited me because I'm not really in this area of philosophy of Chinese, but I really learned a lot. I heard a lot about Roger for a long time by the reputation, but today, hearing your talk, I was very impressed, and I have to say I was very touched. Because not only by the richness and the depthness of your understanding, but also I'm very touched about by your passion about Chinese culture and Chinese philosophy. And I really learned a lot. So today I actually have 3 questions, and I would like Roger to share some of your insights. And my first question is about the shared family feelings. And you emphasize a lot about the shared family feelings in your interpretation of xiao. Now I'm concerned about what exactly does it mean by share. So share, we use the word a lot in our daily life. So we can say we share a movie together and we share a bottle of wine, but it seems to me that share a family feeling would be different from share a bottle of wine, because it's not only have the characteristic about relational, but also emphasize about the dimension of intersubjectivity. So the first layer would be like reciprocal, but the reciprocal is different from a simple interact, but about your experience would be constitute and made my experience like this. So without you and my experience would be different. And the second I can think of is about the connection between self and the other. So I would like to ask Roger, what do you think about share, and how share a feeling would be different from share a bottle of wine? And my second question is related to your differentiation between minimal morality and the thickness of morality. And I understand that you emphasize that how the thick morality is rooted in the minimal morality, and how minimal morality is fundamental. But I'm curious about the other way around. That is to say, so what conditions has to be satisfied for a minimal morality to becoming or to, to achieve the thick morality? So this is my second question. And my third question is related to your quote in your talk, and 家之本在身. So I'm wondering what exactly is the meaning of 身 in this quote, because many people would understand the 身 is like, the literary translation would be body, and like physical body, like the flesh. But I think that most people would interpret that family is constitute of individual, like different individuals take different responsibilities and play different roles in the family's setting. But I'm also think that does it also include the dimension of embodiment? That is, we have to use our body, to take the actions, to take the real responsibilities in the family, like what the mother has to do for the child, and what a child has to do to nourish, to feed, and to respect the parents. And it has to bow down to the actions that they take in the daily life. Thank you very much. These are my 3 questions.
Oh, thank you, Jing. That's very, very nice questions indeed. Let me start with the last question first. That we know that ren yi the ren is ren zepang jia yi ge er, so it has to do with relationality. But on the bamboo strips that we recovered at Guodian, Ren is written with a shenzi and then a xin underneath it. And so when you look at that, then you think, but the R is missing, it doesn't have the notion of two. But in fact, if you look at the character for Shen on the Jiaguwen, the character for Shen is a pregnant woman. It's a woman with child. And so the idea of Shen is precisely that you can't have the concept, your point, your description of the embodiment. There's no relationship that is more intimate than a mother with child. That this is intimacy. This is one becoming two. This is really, and also just your emphasis on embodiment. Like, I understand the idea of, for me, the secret, and this maybe answers your second question in degree, like the secret of China has been the responsibility of each generation to embody the tradition that has gone before. When the xiao Jing says that you have to look after your body, it doesn't mean simply your physical body. It means that your body as the conduit of wenhua, of the traditional culture, that when you look at your face in the mirror, you can see your grandmother. But that's just the physicality. The culture, the language, the music, the food, the traditions are all being embodied from generation to generation as each generation builds a connector to the next generation. And so this idea of embodiment, I think, is so fundamental in understanding this Confucian tradition. The second question about what conditions, how do we achieve this kind of a thin morality? I think that Hankins has the right idea, James Hankins, and that is that we need virtuous rulers. That virtuous rulers by themselves are not enough. But what we need is we need to find a way to make sure that the people who have authority in the world are people who are moral. We need to invest in education. We need to invest in education that is not simply technical education or artificial intelligence and so on. We need moral education, and that really comes from a strong family. If we recognize the importance of morality within family, then we can demand that of the people who would step up to take the reins of power. And then the third question, Sydney made it very clear that I'm a person who really enjoys sharing a bottle of wine. But what I would say is that the idea of 一多不分 is really what it's all about, that we don't want to give away our differences in service to a kind of universalism. One of my great joys in being at home for this semester is that we have a granddaughter, Sophia, who is 2 years old. And she has her grandmother and she has her grandpa. And her grandmother and grandpa both love her very much, but we're very different. Not only are we different as people, but we have different roles in the family. And I'm not like with Susan Moeller Oken. I embrace her idea that we have to deal with misogyny. We have to deal with gender prejudice as it contaminates our family experience. But I don't agree with her that we want to degender ourselves. That gender is part of the human experience, and that we need all of the difference that we have in order to achieve our diversity. And so we have to arrive at a relational equity where women are women and men are men, and we live those roles properly. We live those roles in a way that accommodates our difference, that celebrates our differences, that activates them, and gives us the well-being that we have when differences make a difference.
Yeah, I totally agree. So sharing doesn't mean that fusion, but we preserve our difference and we achieve, something we can like in common or share.
Exactly.
Yeah, thank you. Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Jing.
All right, thank you both. Those were really nice comments. I wanted to ask Paul, is the lecture recording going to be available for people to watch the lecture again?
Yeah, we'll have it up on the website hopefully soon. Once I
Okay.
figure out how to do that, basically.
Great. So when was this supposed to end? That would have been a question for me to ask in advance.
Oh yeah, we have about another 15 minutes, but then for anyone who's interested, Rory or Neil will be hosting an additional discussion session next week at the same time. And then based on that and based on this lecture, he'll be putting together a summary, a 2,000-word summary of the lecture, and that will be published next year in Chinese Literature and Thought Today.
Fantastic. All right, well, let's open the floor to anyone who has a question for Professor Ames. Maybe try raising your little Zoom hand and I can find you. Or if you're having trouble finding your Zoom hand, just speak out. All right, I can ask a question. I didn't prepare one in advance. I'm not a good moderator. But it's, I suppose I just want to hear your take on how do we get from now to, well, you say virtuous rulers, which I think, maybe chafes some of us of my generation, like even rulers, we're like, nay. But how do we get to our current situation where it seems like the most cantankerous, least ethical people get elected to convincing everyone somehow to vote for ethical, virtuous people?
Yeah, there's a passage that I skipped over in my lecture, where I cite Dick Rorty. I'm sure you were there at the conference when he said that in ancient Greece, people wanted to, find the good life, and they wanted to achieve wisdom. And he says contemporary philosophers have given up on that stuff, and we're better for it. And we're really suspicious when we hear these Eastern people talking about virtue and all the rest of this kind of stuff. So Rorty was really cynical about, this man who was enraged at philosophical smugness, that we're comparative philosophers, and so we're broad-minded, and so he would really take a whack at us as well. But what I think is that we still need to pursue wisdom. That God is dead, of Nietzsche, really announced a turn in the Western philosophical narrative away from ontology, away from categorical thinking, away from foundationalism, objectivism, formalism, and all that stuff, and sort of set us on a path where it's very difficult for us because it's hard to get out of our ontological language. I mean, Nietzsche tried gymnastics, with his literary tropes, and Heidegger invents a new language, and Whitehead, a new system, and, getting out of ontological thinking is really difficult. We do it philosophically, and yet we fall back in terms of our common sense into the idea of knowledge, not wisdom. And so what I would say is that if we get back to the importance of family, if we turn away from individualism as it is being practiced in our world today, a kind of individualism that defies every kind of authority, a scientific authority, political authority, moral authority, educational authority, I mean, that's where we are right now. When I just give you an example, Sid, and that is that we hear these kinds of reports on China, Shanghai, the lockdown, people screaming and banging pots and all the rest of this kind of stuff. And absolutely, like China did Shanghai really badly. They weren't ready for it. The COVID came up from Hong Kong and got into Shanghai and overwhelmed them. But they learned from that lesson and they did Beijing much better. And so when I hear reports on COVID in China, what I would really like, from a Chinese perspective, if we can if we can rethink China from a Chinese perspective, let's begin from the fact that more than 1 million American families lost somebody in this COVID thing. That didn't happen in China. That didn't happen in China. And if it did happen in China, it would be 4 million families, not 1 million. And so let's be critical of China, in ways that we should be critical. But when they've accomplished something like getting their population to a point where oral medicines can be taken now within a day or two of getting the COVID and prevent death, then we should give them what they've accomplished as well as our criticism.
Okay, great. Thank you. We do have time for more questions, and we've had a few appear in the chat. I'd like to invite Joseph Merce. You can read your question. Be sure to unmute. Or, Professor Ames, yeah, so you putting your glasses on, you can read it.
Okay, so the first is JM. I've questioned earlier in this conversation regarding the power of the written Chinese character. Right. So no, they're all very, very nice question. It's Joseph, is it? Joseph, the Chinese character. I think what is happening is absolutely right, and that is that with the computer, people are not learning to write characters like they used to. But what we have to do is we have to go, like if you go to the Wenzi Boguan in Anyang, in Henan, this museum of the written word, that when we look at the Jiagu and the Oracle Bone characters, there are 5,000 characters. An educated Chinese person today can only read about 4,000 characters. And so this was a highly robust language as early as the Oracle Bone language. But the important thing is it is anchored in ancestral sacrifice. And so the importance of family in the evolution of the Chinese character, I think, is really important. I don't think that one of my colleagues at the University of Hawaii, a man named John DeFrancis, was an old style Marxist who wanted to recommend that Chinese abandon the Chinese character because it's an obstacle to education. I love John DeFrancis. He was the grand old man of our university, but I disagreed with him fundamentally that the written character as an aesthetic, the written character as its implications are really profound. That the idea of imagistic thinking that is different from conceptual thinking, if we think of Zhang Shanglong, who makes this kind of a distinction, 相思维 versus 概念思维, imagistic thinking versus conceptual thinking. And so just to underscore, Joseph, the importance of the character, right now you stay in Japan and China too, students are kind of drifting away from the character, but I don't think so. Like when I look at the quality of translation that is emerging in China, when I look at my students, when they write in Chinese, the quality of the language that they're producing, it is really encouraging that just as we revise in our efforts to write papers and so on, that's happening in the Chinese world as well. So the technologies take away something. My handwriting is really bad. I couldn't look at the American Constitution. I don't have that kind of a hand, but I can revise papers. And so it's give and take, I think, with these different technologies.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have time for one more question. Junyang Ing.
Oh, hello. Sorry. I thought it was not. Hello, Professor Ames. Nice to see you. So I think I'm not here. Can you see me?
Not yet, but I'm hoping.
Yeah, well, sorry.
Oh, now you're coming in.
Okay, I'm sort of, yeah, I'm just appearing now. Nice to see you again, Professor Ames. Yes, so my question is really on a separate issue on comparative philosophy. So I know that there is this International Society for Comparative Studies of Chinese and Western Philosophy, but recently there's a new society that's called the International Society for Comparative Philosophy toward World Philosophy. And I was just wondering if you knew about the differences between the two societies, and if the second one takes on a more fusionist approach towards comparative philosophy. Yeah, the kind of fusion. Yeah.
Good to see you, Junior. Yeah. Are you in Singapore?
No, I'm in Australia. Yeah, I'm hoping to come to see you though in
Oh yeah,
November.
that's right. That's right. That last message.
Yeah.
No, I think, you know, we have all of these different societies and they're proliferating, and each one of them takes us in their own particular direction. You know, comparative philosophy, in the old way of thinking about it, you know, early on, comparative philosophy was trying to sublimate out of cultural differences some kind of universal morality. We gave up on that, you know, and so each generation is going to be redefining what we mean as we talk about global philosophy or world philosophy, and different people are making different points. And so we have a society called the World Consortium for Confucian Philosophy, for researching Confucian philosophies. And our big thing is to try to pull China and Japan and Korea and Vietnam together, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, the Sinitic world, but to bring it into a conversation with the world broadly. And so, Junyang, I would just say that each one of these societies is setting out its own objectives. And they're moving in the same direction, but they're also different. 异多部分, and I'm quite happy with that.
I see. Okay. Thank you, Professor Ames.
All right, we will end there. Thank you again, Roger, for participating, and I'll pass it over to Paul for any closing comments.
Thanks, Sid, and for the vodka.
Yeah, no, I think we're all set, Professor Ames, unless you have anything else to add.
No, I think what you're doing here, Paul, is a wonderful thing, and that is sort of bringing all people together at different levels, different stages in our careers, and you know, I you know, just celebrate what you've been accomplishing in this kind of inclusive approach. Collaborative learning, you know, what could be better? So thanks for inviting me.
No, thank you. It's not possible without you and everyone else participating. So thanks everyone. And thanks especially Professor Ames and Sydney and He Jing and Zhang Rongnan for making this such a great event. So thanks.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.